Somebody help me. I can't stop playing Elden Ring. I've played 40 hours so far and there's no end in sight. And now my tiny son's teeth are starting to come in, and he won't stop trying to bite my hands. So while I'm busy with games and infant carnivores, enjoy this assortment of allegedly true scary stories. Be sure to send me your stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them, and always feel free to suggest a fun topic for future episodes in the comments. Now, let's begin. Warning. The following story contains depictions of violence against animals. Creature of Northern Idaho. From Lucky 12. My grandparents used to own 10 acres of land in the panhandle of Idaho. Most of the property was wooded. However, some of the trees on the property were cut down and turned into four-wheeler trails. When we'd visit, my sister and I would spend at least one of the days up there riding four-wheelers. During one of these trips, I had an encounter with something. The day started out normally, with my family waking up and having breakfast. As usual, my sister and I asked our grandparents if we could go ride the four-wheelers. After getting permission to do so, we went outside to the shed behind their house, and we started up the four-wheelers. After a few hours of riding on the trails, I saw my sister parked next to the shed. I drove up next to her. She said she was going to get a drink and asked me if I wanted one. I told her no thanks and continued driving. After a few turns, I heard a loud growl over the engine of the four-wheeler. I came to a complete stop, thinking something was wrong with the engine. But then I heard the growl again, only this time it was louder, more guttural. At this point, I noticed the forest had gone completely silent. The usual bird sounds and insect noises were gone. I began frantically searching for what made that growl. That's when I saw it. In a large bush just off the trail, I saw two large yellow eyes looking back at me. Those eyes were probably 8 or 9 feet off the ground, and protruding from the top of the bush were antlers. Once I saw this thing, I felt a feeling of dread wash over me. I could tell that if this creature wanted to kill me, it could. My fight or flight instinct kicked in, and subconsciously my brain apparently decided on flight. I turned the four-wheeler back on and sped out of those woods. A few months later, in the fall of that year, we were visiting my grandparents again. 7 turkeys had moved onto their property, and about halfway through our trip, we noticed that one of the turkeys had gone missing. We tried not to think too much of it. Later on, I went for a ride on a four-wheeler. When I was passing the spot I'd heard that growl earlier that year, I noticed a smell of rot and decay. I ventured slightly into the woods, and I found a mutilated turkey. I realized what must have killed this turkey and quickly went back to the four-wheeler, and I drove back. On the same trip, we were leaving my grandparents' house to go to the nearby city. When we were pulling out of their driveway, a large dark figure ran across the road leaving their property. My grandparents insisted that it was a coyote, but coyotes do not run on 2 legs, like the thing we saw crossing the road. A few years after that, my grandparents moved out of that house. They said it was to be closer to family, but they didn't move that much closer, and they seemed anxious to move when we helped them move out. I think they saw that creature too, which I now believe may be a Wendigo. I think that's what scared them away. The Weeping Thing. From SR. I would have been around 10 at the time this happened, and that was decades ago. My eldest uncle John and his wife Anna had just acquired some property and built their first home together. It was a big enough place, 3 bedrooms including a master, 2 baths, open living room and dining spaces, and a kitchen. As was the style in the Caribbean back then, the house was built on concrete posts, so underneath the house there was enough room to park the cars, as well as a storeroom for tools. You could even hang a hammock from 2 posts and enjoy the cool evening breeze. You needed to climb about 18 stairs to get to the 2nd level, and there was also a door near the kitchen with another flight of stairs, which provided an exit toward the back of the house. To the east, there was nothing but open, undeveloped land, with the nearest house some 500 yards away. However, to the west lived the closest neighbor in a small flat apartment that was just about 10 feet from the chain-linked fence that surrounded my uncle's house. The house was built on newly developed land, which was formerly covered by sugarcane and part of an old plantation estate. My uncle and his wife had just had their first baby, and because it was just the two of them, now 3 of them, in a new neighborhood, his younger brother Steve stayed with them. It was a decision he would come to regret. When my uncle's kid cousin, Nadia, was still a toddler, she would stay with my grandparents, which is where I lived as well. My grand's home was very much still the family home, and all the kids would have spent time growing up under their watch. They would babysit Nadia from Monday to Friday, because John and Steve, as well as Anna, all worked long hours, and so they'd pick Nadia up on the weekends. Anyway, from what I've been able to piece together, it all started one evening when Steve got back from work. He got in just as darkness was falling, by which time Anna had already returned from work. From what I've learned from eavesdropping on the conversations that took place subsequently, Steve walked over to Anna, who was making dinner in the kitchen, and asked her how come they brought the baby home early that week. She snickered at the question and said that they hadn't brought the baby home yet. Steve thought she was pulling his leg, but when he realized that Anna was being serious, that's when he got a bit confused. In fact, he even left the room and went to search through the other rooms. And by now, Anna was becoming a bit anxious. Steve told Anna that as he was walking up the front stairs, he could clearly hear a baby crying, and it was coming from inside the house. It was Anna's turn then to feel her leg was being pulled, but she too saw Steve was dead serious. He insisted that he had heard a baby crying very clearly, but there was no baby, of course. Over the next few weeks, the sound of a baby crying would continue to haunt my younger uncle. In fact, he would jump awake at night to the sound of a child crying just outside his bedroom door. After checking the first couple of times and finding nothing, he never bothered to check again. Sometimes he said he would get the strong smell of baby powder, and at other times a horrible smell like poo or vomit. One day he even woke up, finding a red circular mark on his leg, as if a child with tiny teeth had bitten on his calf, he joked years later. He admitted that it burned for days, despite using a bunch of medicine on it. My elder uncle John and Anna were both getting very worried about Steve, and in fact, they began discussing it with other family members. One day they came over to my grandparents' house, and the fact that I had to leave the room told me that they were about to talk about something serious. But not even I was prepared for the conversation that I listened in on. As a kid, I instantly believed every word of it. I still remember the hair standing on my body and the cold chill that ran down my spine listening to them talk about this extraordinary situation in such a serious manner. In fact, in all the years after, I never visited or stayed over at that house without expecting to see or hear something weird. Thankfully, I never did. About 3 weeks after it started, something happened that changed the whole conversation about whether Steve was losing it. The neighbor's wife, Tara, called out to Anna from behind the fence, asking her an all too familiar question, whether they had brought the baby home yet or not. It got the same confused response as when Steve had asked it weeks before. When Anna inquired of the neighbor why she would ask that question, the neighbor answered, one morning she was hanging out the laundry when she heard a baby giggling from my uncle's place. She said when she glanced over, it was just in time to see a baby crawling into the veranda. So she assumed Nadia was home. Of course, Nadia was not home. It would not be the last sighting either. People walking along the road would see a toddler playing in the yard, or hear wailing late at night. All of this during the week when my cousin was not there. Ironically, neither John nor Anna ever heard or saw anything. Although when they did bring Nadia home on weekends, she would cry incessantly, which was quite unlike how she would be when at my grand's place, and she would always have a fever or would fall ill. But almost magically, she would get better when she left the house. Eventually, my family, who were very spiritual, had a pastor come over and bless the home. As far as I know, this took place frequently over the course of a few weeks. Eventually, I stopped hearing about the story at all, and I assumed that whatever they did had worked. But while none of the adults ever really talked about what happened after that period, Steve insisted what took place was real, even up to the day he died. In fact, when I was a bit older, he finally opened up to me about it, about how he felt something was following him around during those few weeks, something that wanted to come across as innocent, like a baby, but something he felt had much more sinister intentions. He wondered what would have happened if the family had not believed him and did not have the church intervene. To tell you the truth, I often wonder that as well. I knew it wasn't human. From TechnoFreak76. I want to just say up front that I used to be the biggest skeptic of anything paranormal. I could scientifically explain just about anything someone heard or saw. My husband would tell me of a few ghost experiences he'd had, and I always made it out like it was all in his head. I learned later on that you never really believe, not until it happens to you. It was October, and it was my husband's turn to be on call for the city water department, fixing water leaks in the road and all that. He left about 8 p.m. to go fix a rather big leak that had water gushing out of the middle of the road. "I might be really late. We're gonna have to repair the road too," he said as he gave me a hug and kiss goodbye. "All right, me and the kids will just watch a movie or something," I replied. I have 3 kids of my own and a stepson who's the same age as my youngest daughter. We decided to get some popcorn and blankets and watch some creepy series on TV. I still liked watching paranormal shows, even though I didn't believe in it. Hours went by, and it was midnight, yet my husband still wasn't home. I wasn't really worried, because it wasn't the first time he had been out all night. Soon it was 3 a.m., and the series we were watching was on its second to last episode. I looked around the room and all the kids were passed out, so I decided to put them to bed. My stepson's bedroom was on the main floor level, and everyone else's was downstairs. My daughter was the last to tuck in. As I closed the door to my daughter's room, I decided to go upstairs and turn off the TV and lights and lock the doors. On the way to the stairs, I had to pass the laundry room. It was the only room downstairs that had not been finished, so it was still bare cement walls and 2x4s, with insulation and string hanging in a few places from the ceiling. It was always kind of creepy to me, and I never really liked being down there. It's also where we stored boxes of random stuff and things we didn't need. I also never liked the door to our bedroom being open at night, not even a crack, because it was across the hall from the laundry room. I always felt like something was watching me in the darkness from there. As I get to the stairs, I literally got to the second step before an intense and powerful feeling washed over me, like I get hit by a mile-high waterfall for 10 seconds. I recognized it as anger, pure, intense, and directed at me. I froze, and I wasn't sure what I would see if I turned around. I wasn't sure I wanted to find out either. I'm not someone that scares easily, so I decided to turn around and look anyway. Now, what happened next probably happened within the time frame of 15 minutes maximum, and it's really hard to describe. I turned to look at whatever might be there, and I saw nothing. No orbs, no disembodied voice saying, "Get out," nothing. However, all of a sudden, my brain was flooded with a ton of information, like someone had plugged it straight into a computer and hit download. I was getting so much information on this thing all at once, I could barely keep up. Then when I could finally process it, I understood. It wasn't human. I knew it wasn't human. In fact, it had never been human, and I knew that it hated me with all its being. If you were to take all the world's hate and put it in a concentrated form right in front of me, that's what it felt like. It hated the fact that I was there. It hated that I was in its presence. It hated the fact that I was even alive. I knew where it was, too. I slowly pointed under a tall kitchen table we were using for a folding table. There was nothing visibly there, yet somehow I knew it was there. I saw a feeling image in my mind's eye that it was crouched down under the table. "I know where you are," I said in my mind. I'd read before that if it was a demon, it knew what you were thinking if you addressed it. Suddenly, as if it knew there was no point in hiding, I got a bit more information. I knew it was a lesser demon. That didn't make it any less scary, mind you, but I felt that I could handle it if I did it in the right way. I also knew that if what I was about to say didn't have any conviction behind it, the demon would simply laugh at me and think I was weak. I should also note that no one has died in this house, and my husband was the second owner, so I knew it had no right or reason to even be here. With all the courage I could muster, I commanded, "Leave this house and property. You're not welcome here." At first, there was nothing, as if it was trying to see if I was bluffing. "No one has died here, and we're the owners of this house. You are not welcome," I said again, a bit unsure if it heard me. Then I felt it get angry again, the same intense anger I felt at the beginning. Now I was beginning to feel like I just stirred up the hornet's nest. With a push of courage, I said in the most forceful, commanding tone I could muster, "In Jesus Christ's name, you will leave and never come back." It paused in its rage, as though it wasn't sure I was serious. "Now," I said louder than before. Then, suddenly, I felt a burst of rage, like the dread of an oncoming tsunami. Then it left, screaming the whole way. Even though I never heard anything, I felt everything. I almost soiled myself. I felt drained. I collapsed on the stair, sitting with my face in my hands, and I bawled. After a while, when I had calmed down, my husband came home. I ran and told him about what happened. He understood and asked if I was okay. I replied, "Yeah, but I feel exhausted." We went to bed after that. I look back on that night, thinking about the flood of information I got all of a sudden, and I have a theory. I think everybody has these invisible feelers or tripwires, I guess. And some people go their whole lives with those tripwires never hitting anything. But once my tripwires got hit, it was like a switch turned on. Now I'm sensitive to places and people and things. I feel things, and I see with those feelings. I guess it's kind of like what a blind person would do to get an image of things by touching objects. Later I found out that they call people like that empaths or sentinels. But even though that experience has awakened something in me, I'll forever have what I felt that night in my head, as if it had just happened yesterday. And I hope I never come across anything like it again. At the foot of my bed, from Hunter L. Over the course of my, as of now, 23-year-long life, I have lived in 3 houses. I lived in the second house from about age 3 to age 15, and even back then, I wouldn't hesitate to tell you it was haunted. From hearing my name called and finding neither parent calling for me, to things being mysteriously misplaced, to the occasional clip-clopping of hooves from a horse and buggy that was never on the only nearby road. But by far the encounter that stands out the most to me came from one night in particular, and I doubt I'll ever forget it for as long as I live. This happened when I was about 8 years old, probably. The day started pretty normal, actually, and we even had a friend come over to play for a little while. After that friend went home, it was about 7 p.m. I got changed into my PJs and went to my bedroom to begin a little nightly routine I had of sitting on my beanbag and playing on my Game Boy Advance. As I played, I happened to notice something to my right. It was a piece of paper lying on the floor. Closing my GBA and moving over to where the paper was lying, I flipped it over and saw it was a drawing I had done of a couple of Pokemon. A drawing that I always kept pinned up on a small corkboard on my wall. I began to worry, as if it had fallen down, that meant the thumbtack must have fallen out as well, and seeing how I was barefoot and in sleepwear, I wanted to find it before I or someone else stepped on it and got hurt. As I carefully scoured the floor for the thumbtack, I had little success, until I looked back up on the corkboard and saw a red tack stuck in it. It's important to understand that I had about 4 green tacks, a blue one and a red one. This drawing was of the 2 Pokemon, Latios and Latias, and seeing how I liked Latias, the red one, more, I always hung this drawing up with a single red tack. I feared the paper had been ripped and fell to the floor, but as I looked closer, I saw that in fact there was still only a single small hole punched through the paper. This meant that the tack and drawing had been taken off the corkboard, separated, and only the tack returned to the board. I had no recollection of doing this, but began to wonder if I had taken the drawing down to show our friend who came over. No, that couldn't be right. They wouldn't really have cared. So then how had this happened? Deciding to just assume this was my doing and I couldn't remember, I hung the drawing back up and continued my usual nightly routine. Later on, at about 8:30 to 9, I finally went to bed. I always struggle falling asleep, and this night was no different. Not too long into the night, I heard a soft banging from the opposite corner of the room. That was where my closet was. My closet had 2 sliding doors, one in front of the other, and the wheels for sliding were on the top of the doors, but not the bottoms. This meant that you could pull the frontmost door back a few inches and let go, and it would swing back and bump into the inner door, resulting in a distinct banging sound. That was the noise I heard coming from my closet. However, because of how loose the outer door was, anything that could shake the house even a little bit, from stomping feet to slamming a door to large vehicles driving by, would cause this banging to happen. So I was extremely used to it. I barely even noticed it. In hindsight, I should have been more alarmed, as everyone would have been in bed at the time. My cat wasn't in the room, and generally there was no reason the door should have been making that noise. But I did eventually fall asleep. For a while, at least. Because that's when it appeared. I woke up very suddenly, hearing this awful noise like a raspy hiss. As I looked toward the foot of my bed, I saw it, a dark figure, seemingly leaning forward slightly over the foot of my bed. It was staring at me. Its mouth appeared to be wide open. It was extremely dark, so I could barely make out detailed features, but I could make out the general facial structure, and its hair appeared to be mid-length. Given where its head was, with respect to the end of my bed, it couldn't have been much taller than 5 feet. At first, I actually hardly even flinched at it, as I assumed it was a figment of my imagination, as I had after all just suddenly awakened. I just thought my drowsy eyes were playing tricks on me. But it did something then that confirmed to me it was real. The mouth appeared to close slightly, and its chest began to puff out a little. During this, the raspy hissing noise stopped. But then when the mouth opened wider again, the awful noise continued. It was the source of the noise, and it had stopped to take a breath. Surely my drowsy imagination wouldn't have imagined something so vivid, in such detail, and with accompanying sound, right? As it occurred to me, this figure truly was there, and I had been looking at it for only maybe 3 or 4 seconds. I remember gasping and crying out in shock, reaching under my pillow to grab a flashlight. In reality, it was more of a glorified laser pointer that had an LED light that I always kept near me. Otherwise, the only light in my room was a lamp by the door, which was too far away to reach from my bed. I shined the flashlight at the figure, and it simply vanished into thin air as the light was shined on it, like a magic eraser wiping it from my sight. The hissing faded, not instantly stopping but fading out, getting quieter, until finally going silent. Terrified, I panned the light across my bedroom, and I saw not much out of the ordinary. That is, until my light shined over my closet, where I noticed the outer door was slid open maybe half a foot. Slowly getting out of bed, I walked over to it, shut it, and ran, yes, ran back into my bed. I dove under the covers and waited there like that until I eventually fell back to sleep. The next morning, I checked the foot of my bed, and I found the same drawing from the night before had once more mysteriously ended up on the floor, with the red tack still in the board. I hung it back up quickly, looked around the room to see if anything else had been altered, and it didn't seem so. Thankfully, this was my only encounter with that thing. While misplaced and moved objects continued, the false calling of my name, that entity never showed itself again. While it did make its presence known, it never revealed itself a second time. I say thank goodness for that. Even just once was one time too many. Warning: the following story contains depictions of violence against animals. Texas werewolf sighting. From Son of Sparta 202. I grew up in a place called Burleson, Texas. Your basic small city. Lots of people and businesses. I've had a good bit of encounters with the supernatural and otherworldly kinds, but this one is in the top 3 that definitely scared me for life. Shortly after my 11th birthday, my family and I moved to a small town called Joshua, located about 20 minutes next to Burleson. My childhood friend had an older brother that was leasing a house and asked my father if we wanted first dibs on it. He jumped at the opportunity to be back out in the country, so we packed up our things and made our way out to the house. Then we began to settle in. 4 years passed by and I started going to high school. The days I wasn't in school or studying, I was helping my dad on our property to fix it up and add new additions. We had about 3 acres of land, and we were starting to buy animals like goats and cows to basically have a little farm. I came home one day and our neighbors were freaking out over something at the edge of the property. I walked over and asked what was going on, and I saw what they were staring at. It was one of our goats. It looked like it had become a snack for some animal. There were 4 distinctive gouges in its side, like it had been attacked first, and then a very large bite wound in its neck. A giant hole replaced where its windpipe would have been, and its back right leg looked as if it had just been ripped off. I swallowed hard and walked past the group as I noticed my father walking over to greet me. Then he too noticed the group. He walked over to talk to the very skittish people. The look on his face changed as his gaze fell to the ground. Needless to say, that night he made sure that all the animals were locked in their pens and were secured. I knew he was taking this seriously, as he got his 20 gauge from the gun safe in our spare room, and he made sure it was loaded. That night was restless for me. I kept seeing images of the goat just hours ago, and my mind began to conjure up what could have done that. We had packs of coyotes that ran at the edge of the property, but that couldn't have been it. We had a high-voltage cattle fence all around the property that should have deterred any outside animal from getting in and to keep our animals from getting out. My thoughts were interrupted as the sound of a goat bleating grabbed my attention. I sat up and just took a second to listen, and the sound came again. I sat there running through my options and decided against my better judgment. I went to go check it out. I grabbed my dad's 20 gauge on the way to the back door and saw that he wasn't home, so I assumed he had left for work already. It was just barely 2 a.m. I peeked out the window to get a glimpse of what was going on. As I looked outside, I didn't see any stray goats walking about, if in fact we had left the door open to their pen. But I could still hear its distressed cry. I opened up the door and began to make my way outside. As I walked down the stairs and made my way over to the pen, I could clearly see the lock on the pen door was locked tight. The same for the other pens. When I made my way to the back of the pens was when I felt the panic grip my chest. The whole back of the 2-inch oak-wooded pen had been shredded, and a door-sized hole was broken into the back of the wall. I was petrified. I couldn't move a muscle. The saying, "scared straight," isn't just a saying. I was stiff as a board. The only thing I could think of is I needed to get back inside and call my dad. The sound of the goat screaming broke my petrification. Only then did I notice that there were no goats inside the pen anymore. I clutched the shotgun like it was a shield and brought the barrel up. Steadily, I started to walk towards the noise. As I closed in on the back of our property line, I started seeing limbs and bloody chunks everywhere. The sight made me gag. The smell choked me. It smelled of spoiled meat and metal. I stopped about 30 feet from the gate closing off the fence. I couldn't make out anything but a gurgling and grunting sound between what sounded like chewing and an occasional loud snap and crunch. I cocked the gun. That's when I heard the low, deep rumbling of a growl. But it didn't sound like a normal animal. This was like a terrible mix of a lion and a wolf, something that was extremely upset that I had interrupted them. I heard shuffling, and then I was met with a pair of large, orangish-yellow eyes. There was a loud thud, like something being dropped to the ground. Then those eyes began to rise up until they were 8 feet off the ground. I was frozen again. All I could hear was this beast make its way towards me, with loud footfalls, then blood rushing in my ears. I began to see a slight silhouette of what was about to greet me. A very tall body, a large head with 2 long pointed ears on either side, thin lanky arms that almost dragged on the ground as it walked, and that awful growling sound that was coming from it. In that moment, as I began to see the fence gate open, the adrenaline hit me and broke me free. I pulled the trigger, and I heard yelping as my slugs hit their mark true. Whatever was there had fled quickly, and in moments was gone. I stood there breathing hard as the adrenaline began to wear off, and I started to tear up. I ran back to my house, waiting for the sun to come up and my dad to get home. We both went out together, where I told him I found the bodies. After that, he got some friends together for a small hunt to go after the coyotes. But I knew what it was that did this. I don't think it was coyotes. I believe what I encountered that night was a werewolf. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.